Hey guys, so for today's episode, I sit down with one of my favorite people, my husband. He was a police officer in Atlanta for around 10 years, and he has a lot of experience with child welfare calls. So I wanted to know, even as a social worker, I wasn't quite sure of his role because I wasn't Department of Children and Families social worker. I was a post-adoption social worker. So I didn't really know how police interacted with Department of Children and Families and what happens when they get the 911 call or a call in that says you need to go check on this child. We think that they're in danger. So he had a lot of those calls, and I figured that police remove children all the time. But he said that didn't really happen in his career, and so he kind of taught me about how the police work with Department of Children and Families, how they assess, if they're trained, and how they assess if a child needs to be removed from care and what they do in that situation, because I always figured, Department of Children and Families were the ones that had to assess if somebody needed to be removed. So what happens, I know that police have the ability and the power to remove somebody or a child, but I didn't know kind of what the training was and what that experience was like for him. So he shares with us kind of how police deal with child welfare calls, and then how they are called into court, how they work with Department of Children and Families, how long they follow up with a case, or if they ever figure out what happened to a kid. And also he shares with us some specific cases that he remembers that were meaningful to him in child welfare and police work. Let's do this. Hi, I'm Rebecca Britt, and this is the Stable Moments Podcast, the show where we discuss all things related to the foster care system and early childhood trauma, from foster parents, trauma experts, former foster kids, and beyond. We'll take a deep dive into the complexities of the foster care crisis in an effort to better understand how to fix it. So I'm so excited to do this interview because, crazy enough, even though this is my husband, it's hard to find time when one of us doesn't have the baby. So we finally found a moment where we can do this interview. And my husband was a police officer for a while in Atlanta. And I kind of realized that even though I was a social worker, I didn't really realize the whole process that took place with child welfare calls and police officers. And I had a lot of questions for him. So I think that it would be good for, our listeners too, because a lot of people talk about making child reports or reports of child abuse, and they might not know the process. So I think that you can kind of share your perspective on that and share kind of what it's like to be an officer on those calls, and then what's the process of follow-up and all that good stuff. So thank you, Travis, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
So the first question I want to ask you is, what is the process? A lot of people say, I'm going to call the, authorities on someone because they're afraid that a child is in danger. And I don't know if the, common public knows to call Department of Children and Families. So in your experience, do people typically call the police, or do you get calls?
It depends on if somebody's kind of been through the system before and understands how it works. And unfortunately, you even run into times where people are trying to abuse that system and try to make somebody's life uncomfortable. They'll understand the ins and outs almost as well as a police officer will. But the general public, I would say, would call 911 if they thought that a child was in danger or need to be checked on, or call the non-emergency line. But for the most part, it's 911 calls. But there are some people that are familiar with using where I was at in Georgia, DFACS, and just doing a referral that way. And that system is actually the same system that police officers use. You just hit 1 opposed to 2 whenever you're making your DFACS referral. And it sends you out to a call center in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they ask you a list of questions that within a couple of days, a DFACS investigator would come out and check on that child and do a full-on report.
Okay, so that makes sense if you're in an apartment complex and for a while you've thought this family was a little sketchy and you just wanted to make sure the kids were, checked on and that they were okay. But I've heard of a lot of reports of people they're in the middle of a Walmart and they're appalled by what they saw and they want to make a call, that would probably be like direct to police, right?
Yeah, it would need to be. It would be need to be 911 at that point because I mean, obviously, the most important thing is like freezing the scene and stopping it. Like if there's a child that's going to be in danger, you don't want them to leave off of the child. At the end of the day, if you just got faces on a Walmart camera, that's going to be pretty difficult to put those breadcrumbs together to catch up with that child and check on their welfare. So yeah, I would always suggest for someone to call 911 if they ever needed police in any circumstance. I mean, no police officer, no police department is going to frown upon you using 911. So if there's any question whatsoever, don't waste time and look up the non-emergency line. Just call 911, and if it's not an emergency, that's a good thing. But they have the capability to deal with the influx of calls that come in. So I would suggest to anyone if they ever see anything that they feel like they could use police assistance for, that they need to dial 911 immediately.
Okay, so how does that all work? Somebody says there's a child that has no shoes on and they're out in the cold and you're an officer and you're out on patrol and you get that call. So you head over there, and do you have like a specific criteria? Are you already calling Department of Children and Families, or are you gonna wait till you see? And then do you have like a specific criteria for what's okay or what's not? Like were you given training on?
Yeah, so that's the funny thing about being a police officer is I did go to 6 months academy in Atlanta, Atlanta Police Department. Did six months in their academy, and I dealt with pretty much all the professionals and experts in that field. But after I left the academy, you know, 6 months of daily 8 hours a day, grueling hours in the classroom, on the range, in the car, so on and so forth. I pretty much summed everything down in the academy to, can you articulate what you're doing? So they give you parameters and a box to work within, but it's the police officer's job to be able to articulate why they're doing what they're doing. And if they can't articulate it, to make sure that they work up to higher, and higher can work up to experts to try to solve that situation. But yeah, if you can't articulate what you're doing. So getting back to the question, is basically, what does it look like, right? So if I got that call, you use the example of a child with no shoes on. That doesn't sound in itself like an emergency right off the rip, but it would be treated like an emergency. You would try to get over there as quickly as possible, freeze that scene in place, so that you could do a proper investigation. So you ask if we would involve defects off the rip if you got that 911 phone call. That wouldn't be the case. It would be something where you went and investigated, because I would say 9 out of 10 911 calls that you get usually aren't what people think they are. There's usually a circumstance or an explanation, I should say, to why the child would not have shoes on, right? So you talk to the parent and they're like, oh my goodness, like he totally just had a blowout with his flip flop, and I'm just trying to get him to the car. I've got another pair of shoes in the car. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. Everything's checking out here. There was no need for me to bother them any further. But if you went in that situation, you went and checked, and the response from the adult that had the child in care was of a different tone, where it was like, yeah, it's my kid, and that little dirty rascal doesn't deserve a pair of shoes. At that point, you're going to involve defects on the scene, and you're going to continue to investigate until you feel like you've left the child in a situation where they're going to be safe, until defects can get to them. So I honestly, like, can I articulate what I'm doing? I would always ask the question, is the child going to be safe if I leave them in the state that they're in right now? And if the answer is yes to that, then they pretty much stay where they're at until defects can catch up with them. If the answer is no to that, then that child's going to be coming home, or not coming home with me, but they're going to be leaving that scene with me and going somewhere else for the night, which is something that nobody ever wants to do. But I can remember a day in the academy when it really sunk into me. There was a situation in Atlanta where a child had been under the radar defects, and I'm not bagging on defects whatsoever. They've got a very difficult job to do. But this was a defects investigator as well, so I really appreciated the fact that she showed the darker side of her job, and the failings that the department had, which, every big department's going to have those. It's just, unfortunately, whenever the consequences of the child passing, that's is totally unacceptable. So this child had been in the had been under the radar of defects for upwards of a year, several home visits, and they all checked out and said there was nothing to report at the time. And when the 911 call came in that the child had passed away, it was like a 9-year-old child that didn't weigh 40 pounds and literally had been beaten down to like the white meat on his back. He had scars where it looked like somebody had written tic-tac-toe all over his back. So he had not fed and had basically not been fed, and basically just from malnutrition and pure abuse had expired, or passed away. And at that moment, you just make the decision like, I will never ever put myself in that situation where I was the person that made that decision and left that child in that situation, when it could have been prevented. So to get back and answer the question, that was a long bit, but it all boils down to, can you articulate what you're doing? And yes or no, is this child going to be safe if I leave them where they're at right now, before an investigator from DFACS or whichever agencies can catch up to them and investigate the situation?
So for you, so they have what, 24 hours, 48 hours?
As far as you're talking about with a DFACS
For
investigator,
Department of Children and Families to come out after you make a report.
they're pretty quick, and I don't want to misspeak and tell you exactly, but yeah, I mean, I always looked at it. Could the child stay in the condition that they're in right now for a couple of days? And if the answer is yes to that, then you leave the child where they're at. If you're like, I'm not sure, then at that point you start making phone calls and you're looking for, big mama, sister, uncle, cousin, somebody that can keep that child safe, right, for a couple of days until DFACS can catch up to them. But the goal is never to remove a child from their family. But at the end of the day, if you can't answer that question, will that child be safe? Then they're gonna be removed, unfortunately. And that's a tough part of that job for sure. But again, I always went back to seeing those pictures of that child's back with literal scars. It looked like somebody played tic-tac-toe on his back, and malnourished down to death. And I was like, I'll make sure that never happens if I can prevent it.
So it sounds like there could be gray area there because,
Yeah, there's always gray area in police work, and there's gray areas in all lines of work. But when you're dealing with people, there's going to be huge gray areas. You're making decisions that are affecting people's lives, and a lot of people will be like, they need to do this and they need to do that. And a while ago, I alluded to the fact that failure that DFACS have made, but they've got a very difficult job. Police have a very difficult job, and at the end of the day, these children are not better off just because they've been removed from their family. You're introducing a new normal to them, and I've looked at a kid that's filled up his belongings in a trash bag and sat in a police station with a bunch of cops at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he asked me where he's going, and I'm like, I don't know. I've got to find out where you're going for the night. I just couldn't leave you. And they want to go back to their mom or dad or respective custodian, but you have to make that decision for their safety. But it's not an easy decision to make, and gray area would be a great way to explain it. And you wind up in situations where the training is, can you articulate it? So articulation through gray areas, that boils down to the individual a lot of the time. And sometimes individuals don't make the right call. Sometimes individuals do make the right call. But yeah, that's what I'm saying. The situation could be completely different depending on which cop shows up, which DFACS investigator shows up, and who the judge is going to see the case the next morning. You're dealing with, basically 3 branches of government right there, and 3 different individuals that could interpret it several different ways. So the path is never clear. And that leads to a lot of frustration for a lot of people, because you want to give people warm and fuzzy, this is the way it's going to go. But at the end of the day, you don't know how it's going to go until it goes.
So is there ever a situation where a Department of Children and Families worker comes on scene at the time you're there? Like, do they have the capacity to show up? Or
Usually I've never dealt with DFACS on scene, and we're saying DFACS, the Department of Family Children Services in Georgia. It could be called different in different states, but yeah, usually if you're dealing with DFACS, they have called for police assistance. So they might be
Oh,
doing one of their investigations and they go to knock on the door and there's an 80-pound pit bull and a dude passed out with a needle in his arm on the front porch. And they're, this is a girl that just graduated college and she's like, I do not want to go in this house alone. So that's usually the dealings that you deal with DFACS on scene,
okay.
where they're doing their referrals, their investigations, their checkups, and they're in a situation where they're just totally sketched out. And they're like, man, we need somebody here to kind of make sure the scene is safe so we can do our job. But no, anytime I ever did like emergency welfare of a child, DFACS was not involved until hours after. And I guess I could touch on that for a quick second. I was very, very fortunate that I had good contacts throughout my career. But if you remove a child, the wait time before you get face to face with an investigator from DFACS could be upwards of 8-9 hours because they're busy as well. Thankfully, I had direct contacts, and they trusted me that I wasn't going to waste their time because they're stretched thin. I mean, they've got cases all over the place, so it could be upward of hours before you see somebody, and that's just the nature of the beast. They're dealing with tons and tons of cases, so they would be pulled all over the place. So sometimes it takes quite a bit of time to sit in a precinct with a child. The next shift is bought the kid McDonald's because they're like, oh wow, there's a kid in the precinct. That's sad. Let me make sure we can do something to try to make them give them a little bit of normalcy. And it's like, hey, there's different shifts coming on, buying them fast food or whatnot and the other. And then the other part of that is after everything's been cleared out for that child to become a ward of the state while they're investigating it, they're picked up and taken into custody. But that cop's going to be responsible for standing in front of the judge the next morning. When you're dealing with adults, they'll wait, sometimes 24 to 72 hours before you have first appearance. But when you're dealing with juveniles, whether it's criminal or welfare, if you make the case at 11 o'clock at night on a juvenile as criminal or welfare, it's going to the same courtroom that next morning at 8 o'clock. So I guess that's another thing you kind of look on. Like cops do not look forward to dealing with these cases because one, they're hard to see and they're hard to deal with, but it's one of those things where they make it difficult for a cop to even do what they're supposed to do. And I say the process has the child's welfare in mind, and I'm glad that that's the case. But I just wanted to bring it up that a cop that could come into contact with a kid at 8 o'clock at night that is in a bad situation, he asks himself that question, or she asks herself that question: will this child be alive by the time DFACS catches up to him? The answer to that is no. They removed the child from that scene. They're sitting at the precinct. They've made phone calls. They've worked up through chain of command. They've called the courts to get permission to keep the child in custody, the state's custody, until they can investigate it. It could be 3-4 o'clock in the morning before they wind up with appointed contact from DFACS that could take that child to a foster home for the night. And then they're required to do about 4 or 5 hours worth of paperwork. That is, detailed, to the point where they want to know the child's father, the child's mother, child's grandfather, grandmother, where they work, where they're from, their phone numbers. Like, it's one of those deals where, you're dealing with a 4 or 5 hour report. And at this point, it's the next day, your shift is over, and you get in your personal vehicle and you drive over to juvenile court and you explain everything that's happened. And at this point, like, you haven't slept. You're thinking in circles, and it might be noon before the case is heard. So a lot of people ask, why are these things not more streamlined? Why is it not easier to deal with? And the fact of the matter is, the situation is filled with those gray areas that you just talked about. They want to make sure that the process is as streamlined as possible and as thorough as possible. So a lot of times when you're talking about being thorough, that it feels like death in a court pew, essentially, where you're just sitting around waiting to figure out what's going to happen. Because the enforcement side, the government has made their decision, and now it's time for the interpretation side with the judiciary to make their decision on what needs to happen. So I would kind of like say it's a lot like probable cause, right? That doesn't mean you're guilty. It doesn't mean that you're guilty at the time, but then there's a judge that's going to see where they're going to interpret it, or they're going to interpret the facts and take the totality of the circumstances, and they're going to interpret whether or not what the police officer on the enforcement side thought he saw to what they see as far as applying it to the welfare of the child and the juvenile justice system, and how they take care of the welfare of the child. So they'll be the expert on that matter. I would kind of like put it on the terms of like probable cause, the way it's like, you thought somebody had committed a crime. It was enough to arrest them. A judge is going to interpret that. A ton of cases that go to a courtroom are thrown out by a judge or dismissed, or there's not enough evidence to convict. So same kind of situation where you run through all that stuff, and then maybe the next day the judge interprets it differently than you did, and they're like, hey, they can go back to live with him or her. And I kind of got off on a tangent and got lost, so you can direct me back in.
No, that's cool. So it's not cool, but that was very good information. So is the cop done then after that that first hearing? Would you ever be called back to court, or do you at all get to keep up with any of the cases?
That's a great question, and juvenile court is one of those deals where it's never done, and it's not one of those things where it's like when you're dealing with adults, it's like I would tell somebody like, I'd worked on gangs and I'd worked on narcotics units in Atlanta, and you could make a felony case with tons of drugs and guns and cash money that was illegal. You could do that report in a couple hours, have everything into evidence, and that individual in jail within a couple hours, right? And then you might not hear back from that case for weeks, months. Sometimes it can be years. But that's not the case with juveniles, right? So with juveniles, it's not like a deal where you're dealing with okay, we've got a docket full of cases and there's really no sense of urgency to get around to it. There's a huge sense of urgency to make sure that a child's safe before you turn them loose. It's not like an adult that's sick and is addicted to drugs and in and out of jail. Them walking the streets is not the end of the day. They are adults that can take care of themselves. You could say, hey, you got to come back to court on this date, that date, or you can sit in jail until you have your court date. You don't have that luxury with a child. Like, so things have to be decided in a timely fashion. And with that being said, a lot of the times these things are picked up. The interpretation from the judiciary is not settled on that day. So they'll be like, hey, we're going to pick it back up tomorrow at 8 o'clock. We're going to pick it back up the next day at 8 o'clock. It's not one of those deals where it's like, hey, you made a case. You're going to be in the court 3 months from now, and you'll come in, you'll indict the case in the grand jury, and then you'll be done with it for another 3 months, and then you'll be done with it for another 3 months, so on and so forth, until they work out a plea deal with the prosecutor, or you run through a trial, which very few cases go to trial these days. Not to get off on that, but that juvenile case that you're talking about, whether it be criminal or welfare, the police officer is going to be going to court a lot and sitting and waiting. And we may need you today. We may need you today. We may need you today. And may need you today on the criminal side for an adult might be like, hey, the prosecutor or the ADA, assistant district attorney's got my phone number. I'll pick it up. I promise. If you call me, I'll head on down there. That's not the case in juvenile courtroom. If you're asked to be in juvenile courtroom, you're actually not asked. You're told you'll be in juvenile courtroom, and you'll be there until they're ready to release you, and that could be all day long. As far as from the police side, you're asking my point of view, juvenile court, like police officers, like there's not a case that is more difficult to deal with than anything that has to deal with juveniles. It's a lot of court, a lot of paperwork, and it should be. But yeah, it was something that kind of surprised me as far as like, you could make a murder case and it would be much easier to deal with than a child that stole a pair of shoes at Foot Locker. That case would be 100 times more detailed than a murder case.
Okay, so have there been any cases like that you wanted to follow up with, like after you secured a child or you went through the initial part, that you wondered how they ended up and you were able to or not able to?
Yeah. So that's a difficult one to answer. And right now, like, I did 10 years between the city of Atlanta and Ackworth. And I could count on my hands how many children I had to actually remove from the home. And yeah, I could, like, out of all the things that I dealt with, like, I've seen people shot and dying. I've seen uh, car wrecks where people were dying. I've seen, a lot of very negative things. But those kids that are, I can count on my hands that I had to remove from a home. I think about them often, but to be honest with you, I have no idea what they're doing or where they're at or who they're with. I just know that I did what I was supposed to do. And that I hope and pray that they're in a situation that was better than when I dealt with them. And that is the case. It may be better. But the fact of the matter is, this is not a Disney movie where everybody goes home to a nice, warm, and fuzzy family and everything's perfect. I mean, the new normal might be like, I'm fed, right?
Right.
Or the new normal might be like, I'm not being abused by my stepdad anymore. Or the new normal might be, I really miss my mom. That's a drug addict that was shooting up meth over me in the bathroom. It might make me and you feel better, but a lot of these stories don't have happy endings, unfortunately. And if they are happy, it doesn't mean it's happy for the child. So to answer your question, no, I have no idea what they're doing. Do I hope and pray that they're doing well? Yes. Would I bet my bottom dollar on it that every single one of them are in a perfect situation right now? In fact, I'd probably gamble on the opposite side of the house and say they've dealt with some trauma that is going to follow them for the rest of their life.
Yeah, so you said you can count the number of kids you removed on your hand, so probably less than 10, and that's in 10 years. So that kind of gives me some perspective, because I would think police are removing kids all the time. But so that must mean in all the other cases you were either able to find somebody else to care for them, or did you take the perpetrator out of the house? Like if it was a sexual abuse claim or it was an abusive, I don't know, stepdad, like you went and took the adult that was causing the trauma out, and so they were able to stay in the home?
Yeah, so that scenario has got to be solved. At the end of the day, go back to that question: would that child be safe as a result? I've got a case that can come to mind where a young girl was about 16 years old, juvenile. Um, Her mom had left off to work. Mom's boyfriend had stayed up all night long drinking, and he decided that he was going to sexually abuse her after mom left off to work. In that situation, he was arrested and convicted. So the problem was solved, and mom realized that she had made a mistake leaving him in the house with her children. So that situation was solved with an arrest. But there are situations where that's not the case. The majority of them do wind up. Somebody's got a grandma, or they've got the mom's got a sibling, or somebody that can come that is blood and has their stuff together that can take care of the kid. But I can remember some situations where it was like, I had the mom under arrest. The child was in the back of the car in a car seat. It looks like they hadn't been removed from it in days. Mom shot out on meth, running in the bathroom, hiding syringes behind a diaper change station in the bathroom. And now I've got a lady that's addicted to meth and a child in the back of the car that is not having their basic needs met. So at that point, the whole process starts of trying to get that child safe for the night. I mean, first things first, you got to call somebody over the precinct that can load up a car with a baby seat, because I'm not going to drive the accused car back to the precinct, or take their baby seat for that matter, So that process starts, and it's a long and tedious process. But yeah, I mean, that situation that I'm telling you about right there, she was the best situation for that child, unfortunately. I called dad. Dad showed up, and immediately I could tell he was under the influence of drugs. So I called grandma. Grandma showed up. I could tell she was under the influence of drugs. And I was out of choices at that point. There was nobody else to call.
Now, is
Um,
that just you? Is that just you knowing that they were, or do you actually go through like drug testing somebody before they take a child?
yeah, so I mean, I had worked on the streets for 10 years, and I would say that any police officer that's been on the street for a couple of years is going to be pretty good at telling who and who is not under the influence of narcotics, because it's our biggest problem in America. I mean, it boils down to um, all the pain and trauma that's in the world is usually self-medicated with some type of drug. So, I mean, you can tell when somebody's got a massive drug addiction. I'm not talking about they recreationally play with drugs. I'm talking about hard drugs to the point where their fingers are charred, where they're smoking crack, or their veins are just littered with track marks up and down their arms. I mean, it's undeniable. You could train somebody in a matter of a couple of minutes to notice the certain signs that people make. And for instance, when that dad showed up to me, I mean, to give you an example, um, his bottom jaw was running from left to right. You know, he's gumming and really sped up and wide open. And that's something that I've only seen when somebody's under the influence of some type of upper. Um, but yeah, so no, as a police officer, I'm not giving a drug test because that's kind of or it's not kind of, it's definitely a violation of somebody's Fourth Amendment.
Mm.
So they have the right to their privacy and to be secure in their personal places. So with that being said, the Fourth Amendment, like, police officer is not going to do a drug test when an individual's coming to pick up a child, but I didn't get a warm and fuzzy from that individual. So it's like, hey, that child's going to be in DFACS's custody. They're not removed. You're still the custodian of that child. But we've got to check some boxes before they go back home, right? And in that situation, my instincts were correct, because mom obviously was arrested with drugs on her. The father could not pass a drug test to bring the child home the next day. And then grandma came and failed a drug test as well. And they were failing drug tests for something that only stays in your system for 48 hours. So it's like, I arrested mom on Friday and had to remove the child. Had they cleaned up Saturday and Sunday, um, they most likely would have passed the drug test early next week. So it's one of those things where it's like, now you're dealing with the totality of the circumstances. The child's been removed from the home, and you are not like, they are my priority to get them back home. Your
Sure.
priority was, I got to get high so I can think about this, right?
Mhm.
So they didn't say, oh my God, I made a huge mistake. Uh, I have to stop using drugs. There's no telling what the court's going to ask me to do next week. I have to get my child back. That's first priority. Because I mean, if one of them had passed a drug test come early next week, I can guarantee you that child would have went home with them. And that wouldn't have been the end of it. But if they could prove, like, hey, give us a little something to show that, like, you're as concerned about this child's safety as the state is. And in that situation where nobody that is tied to that child by blood can pass a drug test for felonious drugs, hard drugs, um, that child's going to stay in the state's custody until they figure out a place where a child can go and be safe.
Well, I ask everybody that comes on the podcast this, and I think that not only do I value your opinion because you're my husband, but you're also a teacher now. You teach middle school and you teach civics, and you have been a police officer, so you have an interesting point of view. So, what do you think it would take in all of your experiences and all of your roles to end the foster care crisis with all of these kids that keep going into care?
That's a tough question, man. I would have loved to have had that one so I could think about it. But shooting from the hip on that question, what could we do to end the foster care crisis? I'm going to take it back to an incident where I kind of felt like I called out defects for a second. I kind of had to check myself, right? So I kind of told a story that made defects look negative, and you could kind of pick up on the fact that I was like, oh, I couldn't get a hold of defects. I couldn't do this with defects up. But To end the foster care crisis, like that's a huge um, undertaking, right? And I would attribute it to the old saying of how to eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Mm.
Um, but I would I would I would challenge people to stop thinking of problems in terms of they should do this, they should do that, and what can I do to try to help, right? So um, people would be surprised at things that they could do that could make a difference in their community. Something as simple as just looking after a child that you think might not have the best situation. Uh, Maybe just a conversation with the kid, right? So don't look at it in terms of I've got to solve the foster care crisis rather. Maybe look at it like, hey, that kid across the street that didn't look like he got Christmas. I'm going to get him a basketball, point a basketball hoop out. Maybe I'll shoot some basketball with him sometime. Maybe I'll talk to him. Maybe I'll mentor him. Uh, so yeah, like instead of pushing and saying the government should fix this, DFAC should fix this, the cops should fix this, do what you can do to try to help somebody out, whether it would be mentorship or something as simple as fixing somebody up with a meal if they needed it, um, or just fellowship, you know. So you're not going to solve the foster care crisis overnight, but if you could pick one thing to look at and try to uh, make it better, if everybody did a little bit of that, then we could definitely solve somebody's issues. Maybe not everybody's, but um, yeah, just breaking it down a little bit at a time.
Yeah, and it's like it reminds me of the kid when we were back in Ackworth that you had gotten several calls on, and you could have probably easily either picked him up for something or maybe send him to, given him charges even, I don't know. But you realized that this was a kid that should be in school, and you got to know him a little bit, and you brought him to get food, and you got him into jujitsu. So can you tell us that story and like how it was just, I guess it was just your choice to, rather than see this kid as a problem, you saw it as an opportunity to make a difference?
Yeah, so that kid, and I'd have to give a little bit of backstory on the time. This was about the time that the incident with the unfortunate incident with Trayvon Martin had happened, and that young child had been killed for a similar situation for walking through a neighborhood, right? And so everybody in the United States of America was kind of polarized at the time. They either were on the side that, well, wanted to support Zimmerman for being the neighborhood watch that was challenging anybody that looked suspicious. And then you had the side that was like, dude, you killed a kid for walking through your neighborhood. So to give that backstory, I give that because um, that was the energy in the neighborhood at the time. I was a young black kid walking through a neighborhood, and somebody had actually yelled a racial slur out on him. He had not done anything wrong other than not being in school and kind of walking around shooting basketball. So um, that had happened. And then another party actually called the police on him for being suspicious. So I showed up and he explained to me that um, somebody had called him a racial slur, and then somebody called the police on him, and it just kind of touched my heart. I felt bad for him because he was just being a kid, no different than I was whenever I was a kid, walking through people's yards or riding a dirt bike or being silly, doing something I shouldn't have been doing, but at the end of the day, just being a kid. Um, so it kind of pulled on my heartstrings to kind of look out for him and figure out why he wasn't in school and try to get him back on the right path. Um, because yeah, I mean, I don't know how long it would be before I was mistreated in a neighborhood before I started to kind of polarize things of there are them and then there's me.
Mm.
And if you can look at things in a situation where it's them and me, then when somebody's front door gets kicked in and their PlayStation gets stolen, um, as a police officer, it starts to kind of make more sense. And I'm not saying that that's right. It's obviously wrong. But when nobody's looking out for you, and in fact, everybody wants you to go away and treat you like a leper of society, um, then some people turn to embrace that. And he was at a point where he was still innocent. Um, and I say innocent through like his mannerisms and everything. He was still a child. He's still a kid. He was like 13. but I had seen it several times before where you watch kids in neighborhoods that go from being that kid that's running around bouncing a basketball to kicking someone's front door in. And that's a process that you see unfold. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's just the totality of everything that's going on in their life. No structure, no one looking out for them, or not knowing where their next meal is coming from. And then on top of that, feeling like they're not welcome in certain places. And yeah, I just wanted to help the kid out and let him know, like, hey, man, you're no different than I was when I was a kid. And that's where that situation kind of went. We got him started in jiu-jitsu. I was grateful enough that one of the jiu-jitsu schools offered him a scholarship to be able to train jiu-jitsu. And he went for a little while and went about his way. But I don't know if that made any difference whatsoever. I don't know if it just made me feel good. But at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. And that's a decent situation or an example of some of the things I think people could do to try to make a difference. And I have no idea where that kid's at today. We've lost contact, but at the time I felt pulled to try to help him out the best way I could, because I felt like he was being treated unfairly and I wanted to make sure he was on the right path. So yeah, if people can just put themselves in people's situations before they jump to judgment or hustle to say they should do this or they should do that, or that person shouldn't be here, that person shouldn't be there. Think about it if you were on the flip side of that coin. And I'm by no means the type of person that was passive when it was time to aggressively enforce the law. I also was the type of person that would, without impunity, lock somebody up for the rest of their life if that's what was needed. But there are times where some compassion would do better than put a stick upside somebody's head and tell them, do what I want you to do. So I would tell people to be compassionate if that's an option, and help folks out, because once individuals become predators, they very rarely come back.
Such good stuff, such a good message and good perspective. I think that a lot of times when people say they also lump everything together. They lump the judges with Department of Children and Families and cops. It's all like some big system that, and like you said, it's different branches and they all have to work together.
It's a very easy way to take a situation and make it simple for you, and to blame somebody else other than yourself. Saying they, and yeah, like you're saying, with three different branches of some enforcement side with the police officer, and then the judiciary has got to interpret. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to line up, and it's very easy to just say they should do this, they should do that. But you're dealing with complicated issues, and they are not very easy to solve. So yeah, saying they is not helpful. And that's how I'd answer that question that you just gave me, is that stop saying they and ask yourself what you can do to try to make the world a better place.
I love it. I absolutely love it. This is really helpful. I don't know if people often stop to really understand the perspective of all the different players. But I mean, even now I want to talk to a foster parent that gets that call at 3 a.m. that has to take a kid in at 4 a.m. and be ready to have that kid at court at 8 a.m. I mean,
yeah. When you find that person, please thank them for me from a police officer's perspective, because I've never met that person. That's funny that you say that.
Wow.
That person is dealing with third party, right? So I call DFACS. DFACS contacted me. DFACS contacts that foster person. I never had any interaction with them whatsoever, but make sure that person knows that a police officer that probably missed dinner and dealt with trying to get that kid in a safe space, that they may have been able to go home, take a shower, and shave and eat breakfast as a result of their duty, right? So and a salute to that person when you catch up to them.
Yeah, I will. And this podcast is all about bringing in all of the different perspectives and not assuming that we know anything, but hearing from every person and their very complex systems that have to do with our rising foster care crisis. And I love your advice on telling people to step up and see what they can do and not assume that others should be doing things differently. But it really is just, we've learned it's kind of the small pieces, the mentorship, the playing basketball, the showing somebody you care, the sense of community that we keep hearing over and over again is what can make the difference, which is awesome news because that's attainable and we can all be a part of it. So thank you so much for doing this with me, and I'm excited to give this to my listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.